I will. Hi everyone, I'm Lynn Mooney, a co-owner of Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. We begin all of our virtual events the same way that we begin our in-store events, and that's with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in taking a moment to acknowledge that the land on which our store stands is the occupied, unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and about the rightful owners of the land where you are this evening by going to the website native-land.ca. Speaking of brick and mortar bookstore things, in case some of you don't know, our store has reopened for foot traffic type business. Our new hours are that we're open 7 days a week from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. and we'd be delighted to see you all visit us. Even though the store is reopened now for shopping, we continue to do our events virtually. So please follow us on social media so you don't miss anything that we have coming up. For example, one event that we're all really excited about here is an event we're doing soon with Nnedi Okorafor. She's got lots of books out that you're probably already familiar with. In this case, she'll be discussing her brand new middle grade novel called Ikenga. Just like tonight, please sign up for that on Eventbrite, and you can see it on our Crowdcast channel. Now, a few tips for tonight. You can use the chat bar on the side of the screen to talk to one another and virtually applaud Kathleen and Julia at any time you want to. We certainly encourage the applause. If you want to ask either Kathleen or Julia a question, you can do that at any time as well using the Ask a Question box located at the bottom of your screen. And also at the bottom for your convenience is the Buy the Books box, so check that out too. Okay, now let's go get into it. Julia Fine, who's here with us tonight, is the author of the book What Should Be Wild, and she has a new novel coming out in February from Harper called The Upstairs House, which we're very excited about, and she lives in Chicago. Kathleen Rooney is a founding editor of Rose Metal Press, an independent nonprofit publisher of literary work in hybrid genres, as well as a founding member of Poems While You Wait. She teaches in the English department at DePaul University. Her reviews and criticism have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, Bitch, The Nation, and many others. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of, I should have confirmed this, I believe now 12 books. Am I close?
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're right.
Great.
Good job.
Ranging from poetry, fiction, and memoir to criticism. She is a winner of a Ruth Lilly Fellowship from Poetry Magazine and the Gatewood Prize from the feminist publisher Switchback Books. Her recent novel, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk, was a bestseller nationwide. She also lives in Chicago. I loved her new novel, Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey. Two aspects of it resonated for me in particular. One is our relationship to history. Objects in a museum, a paragraph or two in a textbook. These things can teach us, can speak to us, but we really have to be listening. It's all too easy to hold ourselves at a distance because letting things in with our full hearts and minds can be so painful. But what if one of those still lifeless objects behind the glass in the museum was once a live animal? There's a long, sad history in our culture of objectifying animals. But I really love that Kathleen is part of that community of writers who have tried to meld their brains with those of an animal. I think of classics like The Incredible Journey by Sheila Burnford and Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, Richard Adams' various books, including Watership Down. There are also some really tremendous recent books. I don't know that everyone's as familiar with these. I'm particularly a fan of the work of the animal rights attorney turned novelist Neil Abramson. His books Just Life and Unsaid, I think, are real treasures that people should look at. But surprisingly, the only two books in this genre that I know of and that I've read that tackle the subject of war through the eyes of an animal are both children's books. Michael Morpungo's book War Horse, which I think a lot of us know through the play and the movie. And then there's also a book called Pax by Sarah Pennypacker. In Pax, war is central, but scene kind of occurs mostly off screen. But I remember clearly there's a point where there's a group of foxes talking to Pax, the main character, and he's a domesticated pet fox. And they call war, quote, a human sickness that causes them to turn on their own kind. And that came back to me really strongly when I was reading the dialogue between Cher Ami and the other pigeons from Wright Farm. And I just want to thank you, Kathleen, for joining that proud tradition and opening my eyes in new ways to how that tradition can be explored and expanded. So I'd like to leave everything now to Julia and Kathleen and just say I couldn't be happier to be here with them this evening. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
You ready? Do you want to start by reading a little bit?
Yeah, so thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks so much for all the great comments that are already populating the chat. So thanks everybody. I like that the chat says say something nice and everyone present is taking that so literally. I'm so grateful for that. So I am going to start by reading just like a 5 or 6 minute excerpt. And I think to that lovely intro, thank you so much for that lovely intro. Thanks to everyone at Women and Children First for hosting events like this. I'm going to read from chapter 5, and I think what you need to know is the book goes back and forth between Major Whittlesey, the human protagonist perspective, and Cher Ami, the pigeon protagonist perspective. And so this chapter 5 is in Cher Ami's voice, and so it's when she's on her way with a bunch of other animals who've been essentially dragooned or conscripted or drafted into this human conflict. And so I think the rest will just kind of speak for itself. As directed by a soldier, John loaded our wicker basket onto a military train. It was a dulcet day in early May. Even the snorts of the engine and the stink of the coal smoke couldn't disguise the luxuriant smells of damp and dirt and unfurling plants. By way of farewell, John checked the food and water in our basket and patted its top shut with his great paw of a hand, that hand which had had a hand in raising us all. Well, my birds, he said, his voice bearing an unaccustomed rasp, I wish you bon voyage and good luck. When the Hun marched off to the front in August of 14, the Kaiser told him, you will be home before the leaves have fallen. Now, if it ain't the spring of 1918, I hope you lot can help the Yanks put the stop to it. He waved and turned, and the soldier slid the door to the boxcar shut. The circumstances of our transportation seemed so normal that I had to remind myself as my eyes adjusted to the half-light that this was no typical Saturday trip. John wasn't shipping us off to a race. Aboard the boxcar with us and adding to the odor, comforting, mind you, to us country pigeons, were 6 horses and a pair of mules. Wood chips and dust, leather and molasses, sweat and manure. Most pigeons are fond of horses. Once we put aside the obvious difference in size that inclines us to think of them in almost geographical terms, we find them quite easy to understand and sympathize with. The train pulled out, heading south and west toward the junction at Kingham, and we animals settled in place, braced against the boxcar's rocking. Are you messenger pigeons? One of the mares asked. The reader may be forgiven for wondering how animals of different species, indeed of different genera, families, orders, and classes are able to communicate, whereas human speech is often entirely unintelligible to others of their kind who reside only a sea's or a mountain range's breadth away. The answer is that I don't know. I might also respectfully add that we animals find it very odd that humans have such trouble understanding one another, and add further that we suspect that this might be due to their rather impoverished notions of what qualifies as language. But here too, I question myself because in fact, the animals to whom I have felt the closest kinship have always been those whose lives are most closely bound up with humans, dogs, horses, as well as human animals themselves. "We are indeed messenger pigeons," said Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is one of the pigeons. It's Jeremy's brother, and John, who you just saw earlier in the scene, likes to give his pigeons creative names. So Thomas Hardy is a pigeon, not the dead English poet. Said Thomas Hardy, his voice raised above the train whistle's shriek. "Are you war horses?" "So they've told us," the mayor replied, "though we'd rather not be." "Why not?" I asked. "I thought horses love war." The mayor snorted, as did her 5 compatriots. "Men love war," she said. "Kings love it, and so do their poets. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. 1,200 if you count the horses. Most of those men didn't survive the charge of a light brigade. Most of those horses didn't. The poets don't rhyme about that, do they?" That struck me as cynical but not false. The horse kept her head low, shifting her hooves to the train's chuff as it picked up speed. "Our groom told us that horses can't even charge in war," she said. "The battlefield's all pits and barbed wire. We'll just haul supplies to the front lines." "What's wrong with hauling supplies?" said one of the mules in her heavy canvas halter. "Nothing at all, Edna dear," said the horse, clearly accustomed to placating her comrade. "I'm just explaining to these birds how far removed our war will be from the gallant cavalry exploits of old." Just because you dray horses can trace a sliver more of your heritage back to Alexander's stallion, Bucephalus, that doesn't make all of you authorities on combat, said Edna. "Many animals of many sorts will help our humans win their war. After all, who's to say what they need from us exactly? I heard a story about sailors on the HMS Glasgow who keep a pig as a mascot. They took him from a German cruiser they sank and kept him as a lucky charm instead of eating him." "An exception that proves the rule," said the horse. "The sailors know they're no different from the pig. They spared it just as they'd want to be spared because sparing it made them feel powerful, although they're not. If they thought any of us were ever coming back, then the British government wouldn't have to force the farmers to donate us. You're not here on your own accord, are you, birdies?" "Of course we're not," I answered, the fresh straw in the basket fragrant beneath my claws. "But we're honored to be going. We're ready to put our skills to use for something besides winning prize money." The horse hoisted her head to peer at me with her beetle-black eye. I suppose if I were flying over the trenches instead of toiling in the muck, then I might think the same. None of us has a choice, so it really doesn't matter. As for me, I'll do my job, but I'll do it with my eyes wide open, not fogged with slogans of shared sacrifice. Our injured stableman told me the tale about the children of Lord Kitchener and a letter they wrote him. "Please spare our pony Betty. It would break our hearts to let her go." "And was Betty spared?" asked Edna the mule. "You bet your tail she was," said the mare with a toss of her mane. We sank into a momentary silence. From inside our basket, between the planks of the boxcar, we could see the countryside clipping along. Land that only a few weeks ago had been brown and drab beneath us on our practice flights now flashed by in verdant grass and blinking bloom, apple, cherry, and pear trees filling the air with blossoms. "I still say they'd be lost without us," Thomas Hardy piped up, cheerful as was his welcome way, a way I never shared but miss. "The humans, I mean. They wouldn't know what to make of themselves. I've heard that they call George Clemenceau the tiger to make him sound brave." Edna brayed. "I've heard that they call Lloyd George the goat," she said, "because he's as randy as a billy when it comes to the ladies." "They also say," said another of the horses, "that he's hung like one of us, as the phrase goes." And so the ride went on, from Kingham through Oxford toward London along the Thames, stopping now and then for water or coal or to be shunted onto a longer train. And our conversation, too, went on in this crasser vein, which I would learn is typical among man and beast alike in times of war, talk of death giving way to talk of sex. As we rolled on, I thought about what Thomas Hardy had said, the idea that animals need humans to understand themselves. Later on the battlefield, I would come to see soldiers befriend the field mice and wrens who ventured into the trenches seeking morsels of food. Even the smallest creature, a spider on her web, could give a man the mercy of taking his mind off the violence raging at all hours, reminding him that the earth still retains some forms of order, even within the catastrophe. And I'll leave it there. Oh, Julia, I think you're muted.
I definitely am. I had muted myself to make sure I wasn't distracting. Thank you for letting me know. Congratulations on the launch of the book, and thank you for reading. So I'm not sure how much information those in the audience have about the book, but Jeremy and Major Whittlesey are both actual historical figures. And so I'm curious, first off, to know how you found them, whether it was sort of World War I that led you to them or they came first, and also what your process was in sort of writing a fictionalized account of real people and how you balanced the need to sort of be accountable to the actual pigeon and man, and trying to create sort of a fictionalized version and write a novel that has a narrative arc.
I love that question. That's a great start. So I like saying where I got my idea. I love that question at readings, like where did the idea come from? And I think two places, kind of from World War I and then from Cherami herself. And so I think my dad is there listening with my mom. So shout out to my dad, who was in the military, in the reserves for much of the time I knew him from my childhood until relatively recently. And as part of that, he sometimes would teach classes about military history. And I think just through being in a household where that was kind of a topic of conversation and I would see books around, I became really, really fascinated with World War I. And I think I hesitate to say that World War I is my favorite war, because I do not like war, but it's the war that I am most drawn to, because I think of all the wars, at least as I've read about them, it to me demonstrates like the sheer futility and senselessness of it, because it was global, because it was the first sort of global conflict of that scale, because so much of what was gained and lost either paved the way for further atrocities or just didn't matter. Like, it was just so wasteful. And then also because it ended up being such a kind of literary and artistic war, in the sense that a lot of the people who participated in it were of this really idealistic, educated class. You know, people, I think most people probably know, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, and these people who were highly educated, but literally in the trenches, who then left us these really harrowing documents of it. But then the other way that I learned about it, I also just love pigeons. And so the sort of catalyst, the alchemical element that led to this novel was my former student, Brian Michich, who I don't think is on here. I don't see him in the chat. But back in 2013, I was teaching a class at DePaul, and he turned in a poem that had this throwaway line that said about a guy sitting on a bench with a bunch of pigeons, but this was no Cherami story. Look it up. Because I'm always telling my students, look it up. And so he was like, turnabout is fair play. And when I looked it up, I just had my mind blown apart by the story that, became Cherami and Major Whittlesey. So Julia, as you said, they're real figures, and Cherami is actually stuffed in the Smithsonian. Everybody watching, if you're, when you're able to travel again and when it's safe to go places, you should go to the Smithsonian and you can see her. And so I think, just as someone who fancied myself a pigeon lover and a World War I aficionado, I was like shocked and humbled to find out that I knew nothing about the Lost Battalion. I knew nothing about Cherami. And then when I read this story, and spoiler alert, it's based on history, so it doesn't ruin it. She saved the Lost Battalion from a friendly fire incident. That's what happened. So yeah, I think, did I get everything in that question?
Yeah, for the how it started. And then also I'm curious too, in writing them, did you feel a need to portray them, like, especially with, Cherami, clearly the pigeon herself, hasn't left actual documents. There's a little bit more leeway when you're writing sort of her as a character. But like Charles Whittlesey is just he's fascinating. There's so much interiority there. The way he portrays himself, probably less so than he thinks, his facade is probably not as strong as he hopes it would be, but the way he portrays himself versus the interiority that you've given him, there's a lot at odds there. So I'm curious about how you went about doing that, and also sort of how you balanced paying respect to the actual historical figure and creating the fictional version.
Yeah. So, I'll start with Cherami, because like you say, I think in a way Cherami was both easier and harder because, like you say, pigeons don't leave a written record that we know of. And also, there's like the only text I had in terms of her was her body itself. Like, I think, in a way her body is, it's in a museum. It has like a little placard, a little wall text, and very little explanation. And you just look at her and you can kind of see she's been through a lot. She doesn't look great. It's not just like a bad taxidermy job. She was shot, like on her final mission. She lost an eye. She was shot through the chest. She was missing a leg. And so you see her in there. And so I think I was just really moved when I saw her by the sort of like written on the body nature of her experience. So with her, I wanted to not make a kitschy, like, "Coo, me, a pigeon" kind of voice. I mean, as you could tell, I anthropomorphize, but I hope I do so in service of not trying to say animals, they're just like us, because I don't think they're just like us, but I think they're as complex and as much subjects as we are, even though, like Lynn said, we tend to, as a race of beings, humans tend to objectify them. So I think that's what I was trying to do there. And then a lot of her fellow pigeons, there's like tons of pigeons in here. There's President Wilson is a pigeon, who is another famous pigeon. He was real. There's one called the Mocker who has this horrible injury. He was real. And then there's other pigeons I made up, like Baby Mine. There's a love story in here. Those of you who like a love story, if you're like, oh, it sounds like a lot of war, there's also a love story. Baby Mine, I just made up. And then with Whittlesey, it was, in a way, the challenge was different because there was so much about him. And I wanted to try to be faithful to who he actually was, but also show him as a person. And so I think, to your point about the facade versus the interior, I'm so glad you said that, because I think part of what this book is about is the way that he became a facade, that like when you become a war hero, as he did, he was so famous, I mean, stunningly famous. And I think those people listening, if you've heard of it, you might know this, but if you haven't, I think it's hard to overstate like the extent to which he was famous. I mean, he's like as famous as like Kim Kardashian or Kanye West. I mean, everyone in America knew who he was, even though nowadays most people don't. And I think they knew who he was for what he was said to have done, which is fend off this German attack for 5 days in a thing called the Pocket. And so I think once the government or the military gets a hold of you for their purposes, you become just your facade. And so I was really trying to show what that experience of sort of having your life co-opted and then trying to recuperate it after would have felt like. And I mean, it's not a spoiler to say that it was really hard and it didn't go well.
So what was the research process like? And did you go to this? I mean, I assume you went to the Smithsonian and saw Share Me. And then in terms of finding like primary source documents, or how, can you talk a little bit about the research process?
Yeah. I'm just, oh, okay. It looks like the audio might be going in and out, but it looks like most people are okay. Yeah, so I love research. It's my favorite phase of any project, because in the research phase, and I know there's a lot of fellow writers here, it's, to me, the most fun because it's when everything is pure potential and it's possible to sort of think, like, I'm gonna write the best Pigeon World War I novel that's ever been done. Like, look at all this great material. And then you actually start writing it and you start to have that experience where the ideal recedes and the real encroaches. So for research, I did a lot of reading, not just about the Lost Battalion, but in that time period. And I think a great thing about the Lost Battalion and Whittlesey for me as a researcher was there were all these primary documents. There were several of the men who survived, which many of them didn't. Like 600 men went in and only like 194 came out. It was awful. Several of them left records, like wrote, after they came home, they wrote memoirs, or they had kept a journal at the time, or they put together, records of the Lost Battalion with their different recollections. But what's interesting is Whittlesey never did that. He was so taciturn. And so I relied on things like, the New York Times coverage, or like the New York Herald. And I think because the Lost Battalion was the Metropolitan Division, and they were basically like New York's fighting men, the New York papers, which kind of like today was still that media center, covered them so exhaustively that there was so much to look at. And then I also went, I've shouted out to the Smithsonian, which was a great place to visit, but also the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. I don't know if anybody's been to it, but you should go. I think they're open and social distancing. I don't advocate going out too much right now, but they were so helpful when we visited. And they have all this stuff that shows like the pigeon supplies, like the little message canisters, the very thin paper, the notepads, pictures of the signalmen, because they had guys whose whole job it was just to like be the pigeon tenders and send the messages by the pigeons. And so I think that combination of like physical material stuff for the pigeon aspect, and then like all the written records for the men aspect, was like what led to like very early on, it told me that like I said, it goes back and forth. So I knew I was going to have to do, like, we were going to have to hear from CHER and me, and we were going to have to hear from Whittlesey directly, not just like one or the other.
Yes, actually, that leads to another question I was going to ask you about the structure of the book, because it seems, if I'm not mistaken, it seems like a pretty good 50-50, sort of hearing from Jeremy and hearing from Whittlesey, and they jump back and forth, in such a way that they sort of repeat each other. So like Whittlesey will say something and you interpret it through a lens of like, this is a human saying it, and then you hear Jeremy say it, or vice versa, and it sort of takes on a different meaning just because there's a pigeon telling you something, or sort of something that has been said like, oh, war is glorious, then you hear like war is glorious and you get the battlefield. So how much of that did you plan before going in? Can you talk about sort of working those in, weaving those together?
Yeah, the sunlight is like chasing me around my room. I think I'll just go with it. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it is pretty much 50-50, and I think Jeremy might get slightly more because she starts and ends the book. She kind of gets the first and last word. And I think over here, something that I think has been, I think it's worth saying, like, I like it and that's why I did it, but it's not for everyone necessarily, or like maybe you need to be prepared. It's first person impossible in a way, right? It's a pigeon speaking first person, but she's also speaking from beyond the grave. She's dead. She's been dead for 100 years. She's in the Smithsonian. And so I think, because of that, she was my bookend. She's able, because she has this like vision that extends to the past and extends, to the future in a way that Whittlesey doesn't have in this telling. She gets a little more of the story, but early on as I was writing, I was sort of thinking like, how am I going to go back and forth? And so every single chapter starts with the same sentence. And I think what I was trying to do with that was sort of emphasize that this is the same events, but from different perspectives. And I think I'm not trying to say there's no such thing as facts or there's no such thing as truth. There is. Reality exists, truth exists, facts exist. It's important to say that in 2020, but that experience itself is so subjective, and that the same events do not always feel the same to the different people. And it's not to say that one is lying or one is wrong. They just have a different experience. And then I also, something that I think a lot about, I don't know if anybody on the chatter attending likes Timothy Morton, but the sort of philosopher and romantic literature expert who teaches in Texas. He writes about hyperobjects and things, but his whole thing is, he has a book called this, but it's Ecology Without Nature. And he strenuously objects, as do I, to this idea of humans being over here and nature being over here. Even just in the phrase, like, I need to get out into nature. We all know what people mean by that, but humans are part of nature. And so I was hoping, and this might be heady and it might be something that only works in my mind as the author, but I'm hoping that that repetition emphasizes the fact that, people and animals are like the same. Like we're animals too. And animals are, I think we can extend personhood to animals just as we can extend animalhood to humans.
Oh, I mean, that's definitely something that I took away from this book. And I think just the nature of having, and again, like it's history, so I don't think I'm spoiling anything. But when you see these men in a foxhole without sort of access to really anything, and then the bird going back to civilization, the balance there. Yeah. I mean, you have to see it as just sort of a universal life.
Yeah.
So staying on the topic of sort of the point of view switch, which I just really loved. I also thought looking at the characters from different perspectives, like, so Bill, who is the one who handles the pigeons, obviously Jeremy has a very close relationship, but Major Whittlesey also has a relationship. Were you cognizant then of sort of, can you talk a little bit, I guess, about the process of writing a character, because it's all first person, you never get sort of like this is who he is. You just see these different angles. Was that something you were deliberate about?
Yeah. So I think I'm glad you bring up Bill, and I think I'll speak specifically about him. So Bill,
is he real too? Was he an actual?
Yeah, he's not real. Everybody asks me. Everybody wants Bill to be real.
Oh,
because he's so sweet, I think, and so great, but he's not real. I just made him up. Sorry. But he was based on, like, again, the stack. I mean, the figure of Bill was real. Like each, set of, like each unit would have had they wouldn't have just had one, they would have had several pigeon handlers. And kind of like I show it, they had three, because the idea was, of course, everyone was dying all the time. And so, you didn't want to have just one pigeon handler, you had to have several, you had to have this redundancy built in, for when people inevitably died. And that included the pigeons. So you would have like several pigeon men, and then you would have a basket full of different pigeons. So, once you sent them away, you would have replacements, or if something happened to them, you would have replacements. But I think Bill was like a really important linchpin character, because I needed to show why he was so appealing both to Cher Ami and why he was so appealing to Whittlesey. And I think it doesn't give anything away, to say that both of them love him in a different way, but for kind of the same reasons. And I think I sort of wanted to show, like in their reactions to him, to reveal not just Bill, but to reveal Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey themselves. And I think they both make this observation that sort of like the right kind of eye contact can feel like being touched. And I think, that was something that both of them valued. And then in the setting of the war, where there was just such like physical discomfort, like the mud and the rats and like the body lice and the constant rain, just having that, like, I don't know, this is going to sound corny, but this like flicker of kindness, this flicker of eye contact, or this flicker of sentience. And I think that kind of ties to part of what I read about how there are all these accounts from the war of soldiers befriending anything at all, just because they were so starved for a reminder of that kindness, or like starved for, I don't think this goes too far out in the weeds. I think this will tie it all back to your question, but how the idea of self is relational. And like, I think a lot of us have noticed this during the pandemic, like when all the stuff that you consider normal gets stripped away, your sense of self starts to be, you realize how blurry it is, and how this thing you consider a self is more cloudy. And so I think, with the point of view stuff, trying to show how even in the midst of these horrors of war, there was this not human impulse, but human and animal, this personhood impulse to try to hang on to things that were good, or things that were stable, or things that resembled love. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very effective. I found Bill to be a very compelling character. And again, because it's history, so I feel like I can say these things.
Yeah.
Because sort of Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey, it's not like they're, it's like a buddy comedy where they're together all the time, and so seeing the same things from the angles, and that they're in different places and that they both have this bond, felt like to me like it was something that really drew them together.
Yeah. And if I can on that, I'm glad you say that too, because I think something this wasn't the original title that I sold it to the publisher with. I won't say what it was, but like we went, around with, like, as often happens, like with what the title should be. And I love the title Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey, because it's like the pitch is in the title. But I do think, like you said, it can make it sound a bit like a buddy movie, or like a road trip kind of thing, where it's going to be like Major Whittlesey and like Cher Ami is going to be sitting on his shoulder being sassy or something. And it's not like that at all. It's really about like, it's more like these two like arcs
sort of like
that intersect. Like you see like where Cher Ami comes from, the farms of England, and then you see Whittlesey, who's this like very, classic stoic New England guy from like Western Massachusetts, and before that from, far, far northern Wisconsin, and then who becomes this Harvard educated Wall Street lawyer. And so they're very different, but it's not even like an unlikely friendship. It's like they barely know each other, they barely meet, and then they're really only together in the pocket. And then they see each other one more time back in New York. So it's really less about their friendship and just more about sort of this global conflict that involved everyone to that extent.
So I have a quote that I really loved that I'm curious, it'll lead to a question. But I think this is just a part where Cher Ami, so like you said, when Cher Ami is telling the story, it is as a taxidermied pigeon in a museum. And so she gets to see people. I can't remember if you give us a date of like when she's telling us from, but I sort of assumed it was modern. Yeah. So she sees people coming in years later who don't know this story and don't really know much about World War I. And after all of this fame and all of this sort of heightened stuff that you see about the Lost Battalion, people come in and don't really know anything. And she says, humans believe that stories help them understand, but in fact, they often merely help them pay attention. The idea that the war can be known by way of a few representative accounts of heroism and misery is a falsehood. So basically, it's Jeremy saying, you read my plaque here and you don't really know, but I'm curious to see how your novel fits into that framework, this idea that, one account doesn't really tell you and you can't really know war. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I like that you picked that quote. I teach it to Paul, and so this is a good example of close reading. I have a bunch of former students in there, so I'm like, yes, close reading. I love it. So I think that touches on a couple of my hopes and also concerns with the book. I took this class a long time ago in graduate school called Writers on War, and it was taught by the writer Jonathan Aaron, who is awesome. And he assigned a bunch of, books, some of the stuff that I mentioned, like the Siegfried Sassoon and the Wilfred Owen. He assigned this great book by Chris Hedges called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And then I think, to kind of wrap it all up, I don't know at what point it showed up, but it was kind of this capstone text was Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag. And, that's her writing about photography and a bunch of stuff, but especially about conflicts and war. And one of her points was that something that chilled me when I read it was that, usually when we think of pornography, we think of graphic sexual content. And of course, sure. But that in the earliest definitions, going way back to the ancient Greeks, it involved graphic depictions of violence. And that violence was considered pornographic to depict it nakedly. And so I think, to go to your question about can we understand this kind of thing, and can stories, what are stories doing? I was really hoping as I wrote this to show the violence in a way that wasn't pornographic or gratuitous, and that would provide some kind of, I don't know that my book provides understanding, but I do hope it helps us pay attention, and that by showing people stuff, they can decide how they feel about it, and they can decide what they think about it. So hopefully, but I also, something that, kind of haunted me from thinking about the reading for that class too, Anthony Swafford's book, Jarhead, which was super, super popular in the early 2000s, which was about the Gulf War and his experience as a Marine. He basically says that every war story and every war film is a pro-war film, whether you want it to be or not, because, at the end of the day, even Saving Private Ryan, which shows you how bad D-Day was, still has that hail fellow, well met kind of camaraderie and brotherhood and purpose. Or, something like 1917, it's you get so invested, are they going to make it? Are they going to deliver the message? Are they going to find the guy? So I don't know if this quite answers your question in terms of understanding, but I hope I tried really, really hard to make this as anti-war as I could. I really wanted people not to get to the end of this story of the pigeon or of Whittlesey and think man, I wish I could have participated in World War I. So I don't know. I hope, but I don't know if that's providing understanding. I don't know.
I mean, I certainly didn't go away thinking I wish I was there. And it seems like you have also just the characters. Everyone who sort of comes out of the pocket is obviously impacted and scarred by it. But to use Jeremy, who sort of gets recruited, you're a pigeon, you go where people move you, and then Whittlesey, who is sort of a non-violent sort of anti-war guy in general. I think the message, to me at least, is coming across.
Yeah. And I think, I'm glad to hear you say that. And I think, I think to answer the question in another way, I think part of why, I'm a historical novelist in this book. That's not the only kind of fiction I write, but that's what I wrote here. And even though it's based on true figures, I think part of the reason that I, as a scholar and as someone who loves history, am not a biographer and I'm not a hardcore, PhD historian, is because I like what fiction offers. And I think that unlike perhaps films and unlike poetry, both of which I love, fiction might be the closest way we have to achieving whatever we'd call understanding, and lets us jump that sort of hard, bright line of self into the mind and the heart of another character. So I hope by spending time in the first person pigeon perspective, it leads to a different kind of understanding or a different kind of paying attention than if I just written a biography of Charles Whittlesey or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Were there any specifics, like things that happened in real life that you saw would sort of counter like the argument that you're trying to make in this book, and details that you changed in order to sort of either make the story flow more smoothly or sort of show that anti-war message?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I read so much. I love the research phase, and I have this like 250-page document of like typed up notes that I took, and then just kind of tried never to look at again unless I needed it. But I think part of it is the way that my attention flows. Like my, I guess, bias or my agenda is that war sucks and I want to show that. So, my eyeballs were drawn to that kind of material. But I think, when you spend time reading about war in general and World War I in particular, it's really hard to find anything to me that makes it seem exciting. And I think, I don't know, I have to give credit to this show, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which I dorkily watched as a child. My sister Beth is on here. I know she watched it too. I think, that was early on like a good example of why I like World War I, but also Indiana Jones, as a teen, enlists and goes to fight like in Belgium. And I think that was in my mind as both what I wanted to do and not want to do. Like it sort of showed, it had a certain romance, like it showed all the muck and the gore and stuff like that. And I remember, as like a 10-year-old being very like, having a sense of getting away with something, just being able to watch it. And so I feel like it had that like tinge of the pornographic where you're like, I can't believe I'm seeing this gut shot guy in a trench. But then it also had the tragedy where like Indiana Jones, of course, because he's our like moral point of view character, was like so sad about the guy getting gut shot. So I think most of what I found that had the tendency, like you're saying, to kind of romanticize or make you think, oh, I wish I could have done it, was not in the firsthand accounts of what I saw, like the guys who had been there or the recollections they had after, but in the way it was portrayed through the media. And so I think, I'm not trying to say the media has an agenda. I think it's even more sinister than that. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think there's some puppet master at the top of the media saying Indiana Jones is going to glorify World War I. But I do think it's a hyper object. It's one of these cultural apparatuses that for whatever reason, that's the depiction that historically has been favored by people. And so, I didn't have a hard time keeping source material that was affirming out of it, but not being influenced by, if that makes sense, like the popular depiction of the war.
Well, it also seems that simply in choosing an event that was so sensational and so dramatic, it sort of gives you some leeway to not describe it dramatically. Like you have the events themselves, like the fact of the lost battalion, even if you just sort of tell it straight, there's a lot of drama there. There's a lot of narrative. Yeah. And so sort of from a craft perspective, it seems like then you can sort of try to quiet it down or try to find those moments that allow you to do what you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can, like one incident, just like that, I hope, the depiction of it does that. Like, it's just something that you read, or I read and was so compelled by, but then also was pretty banal in a way and didn't over romanticize it. Was there was this guy in the Lost Battalion named Philip Cipaglia. He was Italian. His nickname was Zip, which was like a derogatory thing that Neapolitans called other Neapolitans who were newly immigrated because they like supposedly talked so fast. But Zip also was like really physically fast, and he got a medal. He got a citation from Whittlesey for water fetching, because when they were trapped in the pocket, they had nothing because they'd been told they were just going to advance. Don't bring your trench coats, don't bring your rations, just bring one canteen. And they didn't expect to get trapped. And so they were, in addition to all the other torments, they were like dying of thirst. And so he was really good at dodging sniper fire to get water, which I think is maybe cool, but also so sad. Like that's your heroism, is just going to try to get this elemental thing that is going to keep your fellow man alive. So stuff like that.
Yeah. So I guess, let me see, we have some audience questions. I want to make sure we leave time for that. Oh, okay. So Nick asks, what are some things you decided to edit out, and how did this affect the story's movement?
Yeah, so things that I decided to edit out. That's a great question. And I think for me, it was mostly, there was so much information. There was this great book called Finding the Lost Battalion by this guy, Robert Laplander, who is kind of an independent scholar historian. And it's a huge, it's in the other room where I'd show you, but it's a huge doorstopper of a book. And it was so useful to me because it was so minutely detailed. But one of the things it was so detailed about was the 5 days that these guys spent in the pocket when they were encircled by the Germans. I mean, truly, I don't know. He just researched the heck out of it and gives this almost like minute by minute account of like where every guy was and what was happening to them and like the kinds of injuries or the kind of attacks. And I feel like it was really important that I read that, but then I had to like take some time away from it and not make my book, it's shorter. So not make it into this exhaustive, X's and O's, tactics and strategies, almost like, football replay of stuff that was happening. And so I think it was more stuff like that. And then I would think to that question, to kind of flip it, it was also a question of what to add. And there was so much, that I chose to add to the character of Whittlesey that, couldn't necessarily be confirmed because he didn't ever leave a personal account. And everything about Cherami was stuff I made up, but I did on her side have to like resist the strong temptation to put in every like amazing fun fact about pigeons. I don't know if people on the call like pigeons. I love pigeons. I know everyone likes to call them rats with wings, but I think that's unfair to pigeons and to rats. So I did try to like incorporate the research on why pigeons are great without just becoming this like manifesto on pigeons.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that was successful because as someone who's always been terrified of pigeons, I've slightly warmed to them after reading this book.
Yes, victory.
All right. No name here, but did you read other books narrated by animals to prepare? That's a good question.
That is a good question. Thank you for that question, whoever asked it. I did, but not while I was writing. I drew on books that I think I held in my head as examples of what I really wanted to do, but that I didn't like reread immediately before composing. Watership Down, which, Lynn mentioned in the introduction. And then Charlotte's Web, which isn't just purely from an animal's perspective, but it's that omniscient third. So you hop, sometimes you're in Fern, the farm girl's head, and then other times you just like hop into the animals' heads. And then also Jack London, just overall the work of Jack London, like White Fang particularly. And so I think those were very much in my head. And then a book that I read after I finished the book that was, I think, I was excited to and I was drawn to its title. So this doesn't exactly answer the question, but it's a book I wanted to mention because I read it and loved it. It's called Talking Animals. And it's by Joni Murphy, Joni. And it just came out exactly 1 week ago from FSG. And it's set in contemporary Manhattan. It's like a climate change book, but everyone in it is an animal. It's almost like BoJack Horseman. And the two main characters are a llama and an alpaca who are trying to like save the world from climate change. And I know it sounds like absurd, and it is, but it's also really moving and I loved it. So I think if you're someone who likes animal point of view books or books about animals, Talking Animals is like a recent entry into the genre that I recommend.
All right. All right, so this is Matilda. In the listening room, one of your other books, Lulu the Pomeranian ponders suicide as a human problem. And here, Cherami, a pigeon, ponders war, a human problem that affects all animals and living beings. I'm wondering if you want to talk about using non-human narrators and subjects as a tactic to confront human problems.
Yes, Matilda, thank you so much for that question. So yeah, this idea of using animals as a way to confront human problems, I think this will be kind of where I reveal like the original sort of working title of the book before it was Cherami and Major Whittlesey was An Instinct. So like, to act on instinct or to follow your instinct or to have good instincts. And I think in both the listening room and Cherami and Major Whittlesey, I'm trying to explore, I think, human problems, but also this idea of like human thought about human behavior and how so much of, I guess, like classical Western thought, like the Scala Natura, which is, literally that ladder of life, puts humans at the top. And one of the things we like to tell ourselves, the general we, not necessarily present company, but one of the things we like to tell ourselves is that humans are humans and humans are superior because of like our metacognition and because of our ability to step outside ourselves and analyze what we're doing, or like even stuff like make art about what we're doing. And I'm not going to say that's not true that we do that, but I think our ability to understand like metacognition in other creatures is far from perfect. But also I just wonder a lot, and I don't know if Elisa Gabbert is on this reading, but I went to her reading last night. She just had a book out, The Unreality of Memory, and one of the things she was talking a lot about was free will, and how people like to think they have it. And so I'm not going to get into that big debate, like, do we have free will or do we not? But I think, a lot of what we do, it's not always so clear that it's free will, or it's also not always so clear that what we do is good. Like there is, I think, sort of, Cher keeps seeing war as almost this like instinctual thing that humans do, that they can't help but do, or she sort of sees these individuals go from individuals to this coalesced mass where, maybe Bill Kavanaugh himself would never think like, I'm going to go to war and shoot a bunch of Germans. But once he becomes part of this army and once it becomes institutionalized, there he goes. And so I guess, I don't know, I'm trying not to ramble, but I guess it's about human problems, but it's also about like the extent to which civilization is really a good thing or really civilized, or like what we consider civilization, like what it does and what it fails to do.
How much do you allow yourself to fictionalize the lives and personalities of these characters? Oh, where did it go?
No.
Here we go. Sorry. How much do you allow yourself to fictionalize the lives and personalities of these characters who actually lived, and how do you stop yourself from going too far?
That's a good question. I allow myself to fictionalize to the extent that I need to make them seem plausible characters. So I think fiction has lots to offer, and lots of people come to fiction for different reasons. And I think, you read a thriller for a different reason than you read like a character-driven historical novel. And so I like plot, and I think plot is really important. And I think when you're writing a book like this, you have your plot. And Julia, you keep pointing out, it's hard to do any spoilers, because if you just go to the Wikipedia page, you know what happened to Charles Whittlesey, you know what happened to Cher. So your plot is kind of there. Like, the marks you have to hit. Like, I can't write a book about the Lost Battalion and be like, whoop, they never got stuck in the pocket. They never got lost. They were just a battalion. Like, that's not what happened. But within that, like, in addition to plot, I think people come to fiction, and I come to fiction for character and a chance to see realistic people being put in moral or ethical situations where they have to like make a decision. And like we, the reader, feel like what we would do or what should be done. And then we get to watch this character make a choice that we may or may not agree with. And so I think for me, that thing that I just described is what I'm really interested in. So I try to do a lot of research on the real characters and make sure I can display what I hope is like a kind of faithful portrait, like a portrait with fidelity to who they really were, but that also leaves room to wonder what they might do and to like hear their voice as they meditate on the choices that they're making. And so that they're, this is not a thriller, but I do think there is some suspense, and there is some sense, like hopefully moments where you're like, oh, don't do that. Or if you had just not done that, or like, if only you could do this. So you get to kind of, I think that's where I let myself be a little more exploratory in what I make up.
Jennifer asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned in course of researching?
The most surprising thing that I learned, oh my gosh. I think, okay, good. I like this question. I think the most surprising thing that I learned was about pigeons. You're not gonna be shocked about that. And I put it in, but I think I put it in organically, is that pigeons are extremally egalitarian in the way that they raise their children. So like, pigeons mate for life, which, not to over romanticize that, if one pigeon dies, they will, remarry. Like, they're not going to mourn forever, but they are monogamous. And so you have these couples who raise their babies. And so they take turns sitting on the eggs. Like the, female bird does lay the eggs, but then they are pretty much 50-50 in who incubates them. And they'll take turns, like they'll go in shifts, like the mom will sit for a minute and the dad will go find food, and then they'll swap and he'll keep them warm. And they do it until the pigeons are like born or they hatch. And then, this is the craziest fact, and whoever asked this, Jennifer, thank you for this question. You're gonna have your mind blown. They make milk, but not like mammals. They don't do it like mammals, but they do this secretion that comes from their throats, their crops, called pigeon milk, and it's this like highly nutritive material produced for the purpose of feeding the babies. And they both do it. So both the mom and the dad from their bodies feed the young, which is pretty rare. And I thought it was cool. And a fun story, like you can see back here, right? One of the fun things about these events is like, oh, where does Kathleen live? Look, it's her house. But back through that door, as I was writing this, we had a pigeon family that moved in, and we got to watch them raise their babies. And it was so cool to see what I'd read about in a book being like, I was like, is this really real? And it was, it's true.
You're winning me over a little bit at a time.
That's my goal.
I think we probably have time for one more.
Yeah, one more.
This is the second novel that you've written about the early 20th century. What do you love about capturing that period? This is Margot.
Yes, thank you, Margot, so much. And that's actually a good opportunity to say thank you, Margot, my editor, thanks to the whole team at Penguin, to Christina and Molly and Patrick and everybody there. It takes a village to raise a book. And so I think the early 20th century to me is kind of like perfectly plotted in the timeline of my interests, because it's like, I love history and it's far enough back that people really are, for my money, different. Like consciousness in 1918 was different. Like it felt different to be a human embodied person in 1918 than it does now. And I won't get into all the reasons why, but it has to do with, history and technology and justice and rights and who had them and who didn't. And so, it's different. But per what I just said, all the seeds for like the struggles we're still seeing like 100 years later. Like I keep thinking about how, there's a mention in the book of, Shara Mead thinks about like suffrage because she dies in 1919. She doesn't live very long past when women get the right to vote, and so she's kind of thinking about that stuff. So I think for me, the early 20th century has enough similarities, but enough differences from our time period to feel like there's a challenge to me to depict consciousness, but not so much of a challenge that I feel like, I don't know, like if I try to write about like the 8th century, I don't know, that would be much harder, but maybe someday I will. Maybe like I'm so blown away by people who can go more than like 500 years back. I just think it's really good. Like there's this great book, The Heavens by Sandra Newman, where she goes all the way back to like Shakespearean times and renders it so well. I think that's cool, but it's not something I've been able to do quite yet. So that's a great last question.
All right, I don't know if Lynn wants to pop back on or not to say goodbye, but I definitely want to direct everyone to the little turquoise button to buy the book at the bottom of the screen. It's a wonderful book, and it's been so lovely and an honor to talk about it with you, Kathleen.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Julia. And I think one last thing that I want to say before we go, you can also buy Julia's book from the Buy the Book, button, or if you don't want to buy either of our books, which I don't know why not, you should buy a book from Women and Children First, support your independent bookstore. But Julia has a new book that's coming out in February, right?
February.
It's called The Upstairs House, and I just got to read it. I feel so privileged because I got to read it early. I blurbed it. It was awesome. So mark your calendars, your book buying calendars for February of 2021 and get Julia's book, The Upstairs House. So thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Julia, so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Bye, friends.